everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning I am reading my fifth part from Who We Are, the second volume by Anton Chaitkin, just published and available at Amazon and elsewhere. My interviews with Anton Chaitkin are available on my archives, and I am delighted to be reading this book with Tony's encouragement and permission. I'm not going to read the whole book. I have actually read the whole book up until this part, but I'm going to start skipping a little bit just because it's 600 pages long, and I doubt that I'm going to get through the entire book. So make sure and get your own copy of Who We Are. Volume 1 is on my shelf right here, and Volume 2 is on its way to me. I have a preprint copy that Mr. Chaikin sent me, and so I'm reading from that. I do hope you enjoy and appreciate what Tony has done and what we're trying to do to help America get back on track. Because who we are is not who we're acting like we are right now. We've got a whole lot of problems that we need to unpack. And how are we going to do it without a guide? Well, I think Tony Chaitkin provides us a guide that we can rely upon, a narrative that restores our honor as a country, our mission as a country, and our mission for universal progress, as he includes in his subtitle. So, well, without further ado, I'm going to head over to my pre-publication copy and pick up a few days. Where is it? Oh my goodness, where did it go? There it is. A few pages after where we left off the last time. Essentially, I'm skipping the details of how the various swing states, which were at that time Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, came together to nominate Abraham Lincoln for president in the Republican Party. And that was done through negotiations behind the scenes. But what Anton Chaitkin wants us to remember from this is that it was the Pennsylvania and Ohio delegations that were drawn into the Lincoln nomination mainly because of the issue of tariffs, the issue of protective tariffs as proposed by the economist Henry Carey. So I'll start reading here on page 125. Just toward the end of that section, New York was split. A majority of New York City went for Douglas. That's Stephen Douglas, of course, the slavery defender. But a stronger pro-Lincoln majority in the rest of the state gave all 35 electoral votes to Lincoln. The tariff issue moved Pennsylvania's traditionally Democratic working class over to the Republicans. The state's crucial 27 electoral votes, along with those from the smaller swing states, gave the national victory to the candidate committed to containing slavery. South Carolina's secessionists immediately proclaimed, quote, the Revolution of 1860, unquote. 4 days after the election, the legislature called for a convention to declare the state's secession from the United States, presaging a civil war. The Constitution ordained a delay of 4 months between the November election and the inauguration on March the 4th of the following year. In an atmosphere of dread and seething anger, with the Treasury bankrupt from a Southern decreed free trade and the government desperate for revenue, with certain patriotic officials holding the treasonous Buchanan administration somewhat in check, the president-elect and his supporters prepared sweeping changes. Pardon me. A complete revolution in our commercial system. In the public mind, Lincoln's presidency is associated with the war for the Union and the end of slavery. But the sharp change in America's economic policy under Lincoln was also of immense importance, commencing a new phase of world history. The sensational success of America's government-fostered industrial progress would soon inspire global emulation. The U.S. policy shift to nationalist economics would be adopted as the pathway to higher living standards and to power and respect within the world community. At the heart of this policy change was the reordering of U.S. trade relations, which began with 1861's Morrill Tariff, that's Morrill Tariff, passed through Congress under Henry Carey's continual guidance. Tariff expert Justin Morrill of Vermont introduced the bill in March of 1860 and fought for its passage, acting throughout in coordination with Carey, his mentor. Morrill wrote many years later, quote, Henry C. Carey denied that political economy was the science of wealth and insisted that its chief claim to attention was that it sought the promotion of the happiness of nations. His high rank as a political economist is conceded on the continent of Europe, and in America he has such partisan antagonists as thrive on British theories, but no equal as an authority of the subject, unquote. As early as 10 months before the 1860 election, Carey had, quote, turned his persuasive powers onto Ohio Representative John Sherman, eventually the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. James H. Campbell again acted as Carey's personal representative in the House, and he considered Sherman one of the inner circle of Carey disciples. George W. Scranton, another Pennsylvania representative, acted as a distributing agent, placing Carey's books in the hands of all new members of Congress. When the debates began, Carey himself went to Washington to take over personal direction of the protectionist forces. Carey was either the author or the direct inspiration for much of what protection advocates said in Congress. Quote, Pennsylvanians especially repeated whole passages from Carey's works as the basis for their arguments. Morrill himself borrowed heavily from Carey in describing his concept of economic philosophy, using numerous expressions directly from, quote, the harmony of interests and the past, the present, and the future, unquote. The House approved the Morrill Tariff May 10, 1860, a week before the Republican convention, but Southern senators immediately postponed consideration of it until the new Congress convened in December, after the presidential election. When President-elect Lincoln left Illinois on February 11, 1861, for his inauguration, 7 slave states had already declared their secession and had proclaimed the formation of the Confederate States of America. On his journey to Washington in that shattering crisis, Lincoln spoke in the manufacturing city of Pittsburgh. He promised the industrial population there that his government would serve the people's interest. Pardon me. The Chicago Convention platform contains a plank upon the tariff, which I think should be regarded as law for the incoming administration. This question should not be varied from what we gave the people to understand would be our policy when we obtained their votes. And this is Lincoln being quoted here. I have long thought that if there be any article of necessity which can be produced at home with as little or nearly the same labor as abroad, it would be better to protect that article. Labor is the true standard of value. If we had no iron here, then we should encourage its shipment from foreign countries, but not when we can make it as cheaply in our own country. If any article can be produced at home with nearly the same cost as abroad, transporting it is lost labor. The tariff bill now before Congress may or may not pass at the present session. If it does not pass, the next Congress will have to give it their earliest attention. Every man who is called upon to serve the people in a representative capacity should study this whole project thoroughly, this whole subject thoroughly, as I intend to do myself, looking to all the varied interests of our common country, so that when the time for action arrives, adequate protection can be extended to the coal and iron of Pennsylvania, the corn of Illinois, and the reapers of Chicago. Senate passage of the Morrill Tariff had been blocked by Southern members. By mid-February 1861, however, enough Southerners had walked out that the Republicans gained control of the Senate and passed the tariff bill on February 20th. Some adjustment was still required between the House and the Senate, and the bill, though now assured, would not be finalized until early March. Passage had required beating back strenuous opposition from within the Republican Party, from Wall Street, and importing interests. The New York Chamber of Commerce had sent to Congress a remonstrance against the Morrill Tariff, drafted by powerful money men, including Abiel Abbott Lowe, who made his fabulous fortune from opium smuggling while living in China under British protection. A steady stream of blistering editorials attacking the Morrill Tariff had come from New York Evening Post editor William Cullen Bryant, the leading U.S. spokesman for British economics. Bryant wrote indignantly, quote, "The new tariff bill effects a complete revolution in our commercial system, returning by one huge step backward to the old doctrine of protection," unquote. Before the Morrill bill had been passed, President-elect Lincoln considered his choice for Treasury Secretary, who would have to implement the promised turn to nation-building economics. Lincoln favored Salmon Chase, although Chase was known as a free trader. Lincoln directed a request to Henry Carey for advice on whether to appoint instead Simon Cameron, who had aligned himself with Carey on the tariff issue. Carey's reply to Lincoln shows him to be a true counselor rather than an ideologue. He warned against Cameron's appointment, by implication recommending Chase, quote, and this is Carey, "I have learned from Mr. Dudley that you desire to hear from me in relation to the appointment of Cameron to a place in your cabinet. Between him and myself there has never existed the slightest cause for political difference. But our ways in life have been so much apart as to largely avoid each other. In both private and public life, he has been a politician, intent upon the accumulation of fortune and upon the attainment of place and power. Of political aspirations, I have not even a shadow, nor would I ever mix in politics, did I not know that to enable us to have proper measures, it is needed that we first have proper men." Carey furnished a scorching indictment in 19 separate points, showing that Cameron had enriched himself, quote, "by means that are forbidden to the man of honor and the gentleman," unquote, and had bought his way into power, so that, quote, "well-disposed fellow citizens look upon him as the very incarnation of corruption. And his appointment would be a signal to all the vultures of the Union to flock around the Treasury in the hope of finding that the abuses of the present Buchanan administration were to be repeated and on an extended scale," unquote. A week later, Carey wrote to Salmon Chase, beginning a campaign to train and corral him into loyally supporting the incoming administration's protectionist and government credit agenda. Lincoln did at length appoint Chase to the Treasury. Under political pressure, he made Cameron Secretary of War. But not long after war broke out, the stumbling Cameron was ditched in favor of the supremely committed Edwin Stanton. To carry out the program, whose adoption Carey had overseen, Lincoln and Chase took Carey's lieutenant and disciple William Elder, William Elder, E-L-D-E-R, as chief of the Treasury Department's tariff section for the duration of the administration. Three days that shaped the modern world. March the 2nd, 1861, the Morrill Tariff was signed into law. Outgoing President James Buchanan, who signed the bill ending free trade, was the leader of the Free Trade Democratic Party. But as a Pennsylvania politician, he had personally avoided a strong free trade stance that would have cut him off from the state's industrial interests. In the 1860 to 61 crisis of the Union, he was hated as a facilitator of the nation's Southern Empire enemies and had no political future. But he was told that a veto of the bill would utterly destroy his party's base among industrial workers, particularly in his home state. Quote, thus, by the official act of Pennsylvania's once favorite son, the government of the United States definitely cast aside the economic precepts of Adam Smith and set its face resolutely in the direction of protection as a fundamental tenet of national policy, unquote. But of course, the Morrill Bill was anything but Buchanan's work. The protective tariff as an instrument for industrial progress had become identified with the Republican Party through the leadership of Henry Carey and the election of the protectionist Abraham Lincoln. Later, in 1861, Carey worked with Representative Morrill to draft a second bill which would further increase protection to industry. Subsequent tariff changes under President Lincoln would raise duties to such a level that the United States was finally able to build steel mills for the first time. In the coming years, Germany, Japan, and other nations would rise rapidly to industrial power under the influence of Henry Carey's writings and the direct political intervention of his disciples. March 3rd, 1861. Tsar Alexander II freed Russia's 23 million serfs. The Tsar aimed to move Russia out of its deep backwardness under a nightmarish feudal system. The landed gentry had for centuries held absolute tyranny over their enslaved peasants. The bulk of the country's labor force was thus whipped, degraded, ignorant, and unproductive. The class of landlords resented the central government for its power to interfere in their rule over the country and had blocked attempts at economic and social development. Abraham Lincoln was well aware of the evil that the reform-minded Russian ruler confronted. In an 1855 letter condemning the bigotry of American nativists, Lincoln had said that if the know-nothings should take power, quote, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Alexander II had succeeded to the throne in 1855 during the Crimean War of Britain and France versus Russia. Carey's articles in the New York Tribune at that time, through which he turned American opinion in Russia's favor, were based on Carey's perception of the, quote, tendency of the policy of Russia toward the emancipation of the enslaved millions. Responding to these overtures of American friendship, Tsar Alexander saw in the United States a struggle akin to his, the reform element fighting for national progress against the sabotage of the feudal Southern landowners. The issuance of Russia's Emancipation Manifesto was timed to precede by one day the presidential inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. 3 weeks later, President Lincoln would appoint Kentucky abolitionist Cassius Clay, Henry Clay's cousin, minister to Russia. When Clay was recalled home for a period, Lincoln made him a major general and detailed him to the upper South states to assess their likely reaction to a decree freeing American slaves. After issuing his Emancipation Proclamation January 1st, After issuing his Emancipation Proclamation January 1st, 1863, he reappointed Clay to Russia. Minister Clay fully represented Lincoln's hand of friendship with America's fellow continent-spanning nation. Clay distributed to Russia's leaders the printed works of Henry Carey and spoke in Russia on the tariff policy that Kerry and Lincoln had brought back into the American government. Clay wrote that under the protective policy, with emancipation and education, railroads and manufacturers took a new projectile force toward Russia's modernization. Russia, in 1863, sent its naval fleets to New York and San Francisco, a warning to Britain and France not to take the side of the Southern Confederacy in the Civil War. Tsar Alexander had appealed with some irony to the supposed virtues of the landowners in soliciting their acceptance of emancipation. In his manifesto, he praised the nobility's, quote, devotion to the throne and its readiness to make sacrifices for the welfare of the country, the unselfish support it has given to the realization of our designs. Russia will not forget that the nobility, motivated by its respect for the dignity of man and its Christian love of its neighbor, has voluntarily renounced serfdom and has laid the foundation of a new economic future for the peasants. We also expect that it will continue to express further concern for the realization of the new arrangement in a spirit of peace and benevolence, unquote. The Russian landowners' resentment led them to sponsor the, quote, nihilist terror movement against the Tsar. Clay wrote that the fire that consumed much of St. Petersburg a year after emancipation was the work of incendiaries and that the discontented nobles were left without other resort than assassination and intimidation. It was obvious to American patriots that Russia's feudal aristocrats and America's plantation elite shared a burning hatred toward central government modernizers. March 4th, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated. As president, Abraham Lincoln revived the American Revolution, and some of the miracles he achieved for his country and the world will be outlined in the coming chapters. Readers of this work might already have experienced some anxious moments when confronted with documented political views and actions of America's most beloved president that are so sharply opposed to philosophy and conduct deemed acceptable in our era. The history presented in the coming pages may perhaps increase that anxiety. To suppress the fear that one's settled views are in fact absurd, one may take up the defensive position that dismisses Lincoln as ancient history, unconnected to our present problems. But a healthier response to the challenge would be to take heed of what a large segment of mankind still understands about Lincoln and certain other exceptional Americans of the past, that we desperately need their ideas and their kind of leadership now to preserve our lives and save civilization from those who have misguided America in recent decades. Chapter 4, Greenbacks. Lincoln versus the money power. Excuse me a second. Introduction. Soon after the outbreak of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln explained the national purpose in fighting the slave owners' attempt to dissolve the United States. Quote, this is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, unquote. This and the succeeding chapters will show precisely how Lincoln and his close allies succeeded in fulfilling that objective. We will also inquire into the identities and actions of leaders on the other side, American representatives of an imperial interest that sought to hold the U.S. and all countries under its power. While President Lincoln mobilized the Union for victory, he also directly guided the liberation of the slaves through his Emancipation Proclamation and his personal leadership to procure the 13th Amendment to the Constitution prohibiting slavery. These results were a triumph for Lincoln's dedication to the universal principle of self-government, underlined. In its dual meaning, one, preserving the Union maintained the extent and territorial integrity of the first self-governing nation of the modern world. Second, emancipation freed African Americans from being governed without their consent as slaves. The U.S. government simultaneously shifted to an economic policy based on the same self-government principle, devoted as it was to the interests of the people in defiance of imperial doctrine and menace. The U.S. aimed to raise the people's living standards, skills, and social status. Highly protective tariffs adjusted international trade in favor of the national interest, boosting U.S. production power and permanently moving wages to a higher level. New laws regulating money, credit, and banking promoted investments in industrial and agricultural progress, overriding the power of private financiers to effectively prohibit such investment. Projects in transportation, metallurgy, fuel, science, and education enhanced the population's mastery over nature, a unifying theme of Lincoln's concerns. People who advance through discovery of nature's deeper harmonies and hidden capabilities, and people who possess modern skills and tools to overcome the problems nature poses, those people have a greater chance to protect and govern themselves. The momentum from Lincoln's presidency continued past his 1865 assassination. Lincoln's principles strongly influenced the United States until the beginning of the 20th century, by which time American life had gone substantially under the power of the Anglophile financial establishment. Lincoln's closest nationalist allies were inspired by their country's victory against insurrection and slavery. They were ennobled by the great sacrifices and by the president's martyrdom. They gained the confidence that Americans could accomplish any worthwhile goal. They pushed stunning technological innovations under the national protection and federal aid initiated in the Lincoln presidency. Their new industries enhanced the productive powers of the common man, rather than simply providing luxurious amenities or amusements to the idle classes, as typically occurred in previous eras. Lincoln pivoted his political outlook on the U.S. founding document of self-government, the 1776 Declaration of Independence. Proclaiming the end of foreign control over America, it bluntly asserted the right of the people to govern themselves as they saw fit. And now quoting from the Declaration, quote, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness, unquote. In our era, Anglo-American globalists condemn that successful system of national sovereignty. They demand instead subservience to powerful private interests under a, quote, rules-based international order, unquote, which seeks to prevent any nation from rising to great power status. The chapters to follow will examine the economic legislation and national projects during and soon after the Lincoln presidency, which enabled the American people to rise to a better life. The personal leadership of Lincoln and of Henry Carey will be seen in the program of governmental measures for the general welfare. And now a series of bullet points. 1, the protective tariff for industrial growth. 2, creation of a national currency and a national banking system in the public interest. 3, sponsoring scientific agriculture for a constant increase in output and sustainability, coupled with free higher education. 4, building the transcontinental railroad and enabling frontier settlement. 5, the commitment to industrialize the South to transform that region socially and politically. And 6, the encouragement of other nations to free themselves from imperial dictation and to thus embark on rapid industrial progress, as the U.S. was doing. We will seek a deeper understanding of our national objectives by examining the careers of certain other Civil War leaders and prominent figures in war fighting, emancipation, intelligence and counterintelligence, railroad construction, strategy making for the settler civilization in the West and for the South after slavery, and the promotion of the advancement of sister nations. Such an inquiry will help the reader to intelligently evaluate how Lincoln's policies succeeded, where they fell short, and why the ruling powers of the present day have repudiated Lincoln's humane outlook while adopting the outlook of his imperial opponents. An emergency path out of national bankruptcy. Quote, let those who toil up from poverty beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely be used to close the door of advancement against them and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them, till all of liberty shall be lost. Unquote, Lincoln. The conflict was going badly for the Union side in the early days of the Civil War. The government became unable to pay the enormous military costs under the financial rules imposed by the transatlantic imperial system. In this emergency, the Lincoln administration and its allies in Congress created an entirely new American currency, greenbacks, when no national currency had existed for several decades. They then enacted measures to regulate the nation's banks and to induce technological innovation and economic growth. As a result, much of the ample new currency would go into productive use instead of ruinous speculation. This agenda enabled the Union military victory. It brought on a spectacular increase in U.S. agro-industrial power. But pursuing this path quickly put the government into a fundamental, bitter conflict with the aristocratic imperial power that had ruled the world for centuries. This political war continued long past the Lincoln administration. The history of the 1861 to 62 skirmish over the greenbacks can provide us with remarkable insights into what has brought us into the present failure of American and Western society, and how an earlier U.S. leadership made things very much better. Here is the background to this urgent assertion of national sovereignty. President Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, under heavy military guard, led by General Winfield Scott's artillery and sharpshooters. Confederate rebels had already captured most federal installations in the South: forts, arsenals, dockyards, customs houses, courthouses, and the U.S. Mint at New Orleans. The previous U.S. administration had left a bankrupt treasury and a national military with only about 15,000 regular troops, a mere 3,000 of them available in the East where they were needed. Following the April 13th surrender of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, President Lincoln acted to defend the Union as he had pledged to do. He called on the loyal states to supply 75,000 volunteer soldiers. A new army was assembled and began training over the next few months, with the initial task of defending Washington, D.C., which was surrounded by the slave states of Virginia and Maryland. The president asked Congress in July to, quote, place at the control of the government at least 400,000 men and $400 million. The Southern attack and Lincoln's resolve had evoked a strong patriotic response. Such a large force could probably be procured, but the soldiers must have food, uniforms, guns, and transportation. It was not obvious how the government would be able to raise the necessary funds. The war had cut down foreign trade, thus diminishing revenues from duties on imports, and the rebels had stopped forwarding to Washington any duties collected in the South. Under anti-national economic regimes since the 1830s, there had been no national currency and no federal regulation of banks. Pardon me a second. I think I have a little allergy problem here. All right, let's see. So the war had cut down foreign trade, diminishing revenues from duties on imports, and the rebels had stopped forwarding to Washington the duties collected in the South. Under anti-national economic regimes since the 1830s, there had been no national currency and no federal regulations on banks. State-chartered banks used deposits for dangerous speculation. To make loans, they issued paper notes in various dollar amounts, promising to pay off in gold or silver coins, i.e. specie, if a note were cashed in. Parentheses, a promise that could be kept only if the bank did not overextend itself, close parentheses. These notes circulated as a kind of money, but they were often not accepted for payment far from the locality of the issuing banks. In the crisis of the Union, fear for the future had shriveled credit and investment. Southerners had stopped paying most debts they owed to Northern business. The bigger Northern banks were trying to hoard gold. In those chaotic circumstances, depositors and note holders across the country were often left with nothing. The Lincoln administration planned to create a national banking system to charter and regulate private banks, and through them to issue a sound national currency. But this new system was nowhere near ready, and the federal government would have to raise large sums of money immediately. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase was badly scared. The emergency might force him to depart from British imperial doctrines that his genteel friends in Boston and New York took for economic orthodoxy. Chase would nevertheless perform his duties to the nation, sweating in the policy harness fashioned for him by President Lincoln and Lincoln's economic mentor, Henry Carey. During the summer and fall of 1861, the U.S. Treasury borrowed almost $150 million in gold coins from a group of institutions in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia known as the Associated Banks. As the bank's reserves ran down, they put the brakes on fulfilling the last of the installments they had promised to loan the government. Meanwhile, the untrained Union troops suffered humiliating defeats. Increasing military needs made financial solutions even more urgent and seemed to put the government in the position of a beggar before the big banks. In November, a U.S. warship, the captain acting on his own authority, stopped the British Royal Mail ship RMS Trent in the Atlantic Ocean. The Americans made prisoners of two Confederate envoys heading for England and France to seek aid for the Southern Rebellion. Britain's rulers were notoriously hostile to the Union cause, so the Northern public exulted in the envoys' capture. Financial gloom deepened, with businessmen withdrawing their bank deposits on the possibility that the Trent affair could bring war with Great Britain. Excuse me again. Rallying the People, the first annual message. Congress reconvened December 2nd, 1861, after 4 months out of session, ready to take guidance from the president in his first annual message delivered the next day. Lincoln addressed 4 aspects of the national crisis. 1, the Republic's answer to the menace of imperialism. 2. The people will fund their imperiled government. 3. Why a free country is pro-labor. And 4. We must transform the South. Standing up to the imperial threat, Lincoln issued a warning to the European empires, quote, "A disloyal portion of the American people have been engaged in an attempt to divide and destroy the Union. A nation which endures factious domestic division is exposed to disrespect abroad, and one party, if not both, is sure to invoke foreign intervention. Nations thus tempted to interfere are not always able to resist the counsels of seeming expediency and ungenerous ambition, although measures adopted under such influences seldom fail to be unfortunate and injurious to those adopting them." Britain's response to the Trent affair was not yet known in North America. Lincoln was firm and calm, seeking to avoid a two-front war. He asserted that restoring the American Union would be in Europe's best interest, and held out the hope that, quote, "it will appear that we have practiced prudence and liberality toward foreign powers, averting causes of irritation, and with firmness maintaining our own rights and honor," unquote. However, he said, "whatever might be foreign states' wishes or dispositions, the integrity of our country and the stability of our government mainly depend not upon them, but on the loyalty, virtue, patriotism, and intelligence of the American people." And he called for fortifying the U.S. border with Canada, which was then British territory. "I ask the attention of Congress to our Great Lakes and rivers. It is believed that some fortifications and depots of arms and munitions, with harbor and navigation improvements, all at well-selected points upon these, would be of great importance to the national defense and preservation." Lincoln's warning of the imperial threat came amidst the dramatic developments in Mexico, Canada, and China regarding the right of Americans and other people to national sovereignty. As Congress received the president's message, transports were carrying thousands of British, French, and Spanish troops across the Atlantic for an invasion of Mexico. The pretext for this outrage was the supposed injustice done by Mexican President Benito Juarez in suspending interest payments to foreign holders of bonds issued in the wildly fraudulent scheme of Swiss banker Jean-Baptiste Jecker. President Lincoln had already made clear America's moral support for Mexico's sovereignty. Upon taking office, he had appointed Senator Thomas Corwin as minister to that country. Corwin, like Lincoln, had stridently opposed the 1846-48 U.S. war with Mexico, so the Juarez government received the appointment with enthusiasm. During the same December as the Mexico landing, thousands of British troops landed in Canada. That British colony would host a Confederate foreign headquarters in Montreal. Terror raids into the North followed. John Wilkes Booth would be in Montreal in late 1864, getting funds and preparing for his mortal assault on President Lincoln. Just before their joint invasion of Mexico, Britain and France had waged a 4-year war against China. In this second Opium War, Britain again sought freedom to poison and subdue China. During this imperial onslaught, the administration of James Buchanan had sent an envoy to China to obtain a treaty forcing China to grant the same rights to the USA as those granted to Britain. To repair America's sullied reputation, President Lincoln appointed Anson Burlingame as minister to China in June 1861. Burlingame's mission was to gain China's trust and to work toward placing China and America on terms of equality as nations. Popular funding of the fight for the Union. In the same first annual message to Congress, in which he warned against imperial interference in the Civil War, Lincoln addressed the vital question of funding the Republic in its fight for survival. He confirmed that the common people would sustain the nation's finances, meaning that the government would not be subject to the dictates of Wall Street and London. Lincoln said, quote, "The operations of the Treasury during the period which has elapsed since Congress adjourned in August have been conducted with signal success. The patriotism of the people has placed at the disposal of the government the large means demanded by the public exigencies. Much of the national loan has been taken by citizens of the industrial classes, whose confidence in their country's faith and zeal for their country's deliverance from present peril have induced them to contribute to the support of the government the whole of their limited acquisitions." The, quote, industrial classes, unquote, had been moved by the danger to the country to buy federal, quote, 730 bonds sold to them through a force of specially commissioned Treasury agents organized by Philadelphia banker J. Cook. 2 days after he opened this bond drive in September, Cook wrote to Chase of, quote, "a continual stream, clergy, draymen, cart drivers, merchants, girls, boys, and all kinds of men and women coming to his Philadelphia office, over the door of which was an American flag inscribed with the words, quote, U.S. Subscription Agency for the National Loan," unquote. Exemplifying the response Lincoln reported in December in his first annual address, it had been announced a month earlier that about 1,000 out of the 1,500 Philadelphia employees of the Reading Railroad had subscribed to the bonds and authorized deductions from their wages to buy them. Self-government, labor, and capital. J. Cook and his bond salesmen, a nationwide force of 2,500 by the end of the war, would eventually raise over $1 billion. But the initial returns from these methods did not amount to the vast scale of funds needed in the present peril that December. So the president's address, submitted to Congress, sought to rally the city people, the farmers, the soldiers, and sailors on the deepest level of the struggle for their country's survival. The insurrection, Lincoln said, is, quote, "a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of a people." The insurgents were attacking the right of suffrage, proposing in their confederacy to deny popular election of any but legislators. Among the Confederates and their supporters, quote, "monarchy itself is sometimes hinted at as a possible refuge from the power of the people," unquote. The president now struck hard to rally support for his coming political showdown with the money power. Quote, "in my present position, I could scarcely be justified were I to omit raising a warning voice against the approach of returning despotism." Lincoln warned that there was an effort, quote, "to place capital on an equal footing with, if not above, labor in the structure of government. It is falsely assumed that labor is available only in connection with capital, that nobody labors unless somebody else owning capital somehow by the use of it induces him to labor. It is then falsely concluded that all laborers are either hired laborers or what we call slaves. And further, it is assumed that whoever is once a hired laborer is fixed in that condition for life. Now, there is no such relation between capital and labor as assumed, nor is there any such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer," unquote. Lincoln declared now for the whole world to hear a fundamental concept which, as we have seen, he had earlier enunciated in his famous 1859 Wisconsin speech, quote, "labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration." He went on to describe the conditions of life in a self-governing nation state, whose ordinary citizens have had the actual opportunity, not only the theoretical right, to accumulate savings from their labor, substantially improve their condition and rise in society. This, he said, quote, is the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way to all, gives hope to all, and consequent energy and progress and improvement of condition to all. No men living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty, none less inclined to take or touch anything which they have not honestly earned. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely be used to close the door of advancement against such as they, and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them till all of liberty shall be lost. And I do believe I will stop there on page 138. A lot of things I'd like to break down in more relationship to the present time, but think about all of the resonance that you just hear right on the surface. The identity of interest of the United States and Russia, for instance. The idea that labor is superior to capital. Well, if labor is superior to capital, then our Congress should recognize that fact and reduce the power of capital to an appropriate level and raise the power of labor to a much higher level and encourage the free exercise of people's dreams, desires, pursuit of happiness. It's been said, actually, a friend of mine said it a long time ago, and I believe it. If you love doing something enough and you do it long enough, people are going to beat a path to your door to participate, to get it. If you're building something that you have a dream that would be a great thing, whether it be an engineering marvel or a piece of art, or whether you are writing a treatise that will help people understand agriculture or astronomy or anything else, if you are dedicated to doing it, that's where you put your labor, and you're not going to put your labor to some capitalist that just wants you to tow something from here to there or run the bookkeeping department for his money-making corporations. So, sounds good. Can we possibly get back to it? Is there any way that this country now, with all of this globalism, can get back to having national sovereignty? Well, that's what we hope. And that's why we are spending our Monday mornings reading from Tony Chaitkin's second volume of Who We Are. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow right here at McDuff Lives. Bye now.